The Vanguard Echo glided silently into the Proxima Centauri System, its hull gleaming faintly against the backdrop of distant starlight. After 12 years of near light-speed travel, the ship's arrival signaled the culmination of decades of planning, billions of credits, and the relentless optimism that humanity could outpace its terrestrial limits. Inside, a skeletal crew of 12 awoke from stasis, groggy and disoriented, their bodies aching from the years-long sleep. Dr. Eleanor Kaiden opened her eyes to the sterile light of her pod. The faint hum of the ship's life support systems reassured her that they had made it, though the groan of her joints reminded her of the toll of the journey. Her hand instinctively reached for the monitor embedded beside her bed, and her heart quickened as it confirmed their location, Proxima B's orbital sector, precisely on schedule. "Welcome back, Doctor." Kaiden, the ship's automated systems, intoned as she sat up, her breath fogging the chilled air. She glanced out the narrow window by her pod, catching her first glimpse of Proxima Centauri B, the tidally locked planet suspended like a dull gem against the star's red light. From this distance it looked unremarkable, a patchwork of barren land masses and shallow seas beneath a hazy amber atmosphere. Yet its significance was monumental. It was the first habitable planet beyond the solar system to be reached by human hands. The rest of the crew began to stir, one by one. Commander Victor Hale, ever stoic, was the first to regain his composure. His movements were precise, economical, as though shaking off the frost of cryosleep was a minor inconvenience. He was a veteran of countless missions and had spent years preparing for this one, though Eleanor often caught a flicker of hesitation in his eyes, a reminder of the tragedy that had nearly ended his career. "How's the view?" Victor asked, stepping beside Eleanor at the viewport. "Cold and unwelcoming," she replied, her voice dry. "Exactly as expected." Victor chuckled softly. "Then it's perfect for us." The rest of the team soon joined them on the bridge, shaking off their disorientation as the Vanguard Echo aligned itself with the DSPA's orbital construction site. The skeletal structure of the accelerator floated in stark contrast to the barren planet below, a glistening ring of titanium scaffolding nearly a kilometer wide, connected to a central docking hub. The DSPA was still far from complete, its segments suspended like disconnected puzzle pieces awaiting assembly. It was an elegant feat of engineering, a massive particle collider designed to test theories that could rewrite the laws of physics. Grant Mercer, the ship's chief engineer, leaned over his console, already checking the docking procedures. His short temper was only eclipsed by his unmatched skill with machines. "Docking sequence looks good," he muttered, more to himself than anyone else. "We're within the margin. At least something's working as planned." "Don't jinx it, Mercer," Victor warned, strapping himself into his seat as the ship aligned for docking. "We haven't even started yet." As the docking clamps locked into place, a faint tremor reverberated through the hull. Eleanor's heart raced at the sound. This was it. Years of preparation, endless meetings, simulations, and projections had led to this moment. The mission was officially underway. Once docked, the crew wasted no time beginning their work. Provisions were unpacked, systems initialized, and the long process of assembling the DSPA resumed. The accelerator was a modular structure, its components ferried here by automated cargo drones decades earlier. The team's job was to integrate the final human-designed core, the piece that would bring the entire project to life. The sense of purpose was palpable as the crew dispersed. Eleanor reviewed schematics with Grant and his engineering team, while Victor coordinated schedules from the bridge. Lila Morgan, the mission biologist, sat apart, her attention fixed on the planet below. She had joined the mission under the pretense of studying the planet's viability for colonization, but Eleanor suspected Lila had other motivations. Her fascination with alien ecosystems bordered on obsession. "There's something down there," Lila said, her voice distant as she stared at her monitor. "Look at this." She pointed to a set of high-resolution images captured by the ship's orbital cameras. Eleanor leaned in, frowning. The images showed Proxima B's surface, a jagged landscape of reddish rock and shallow basins. But etched across the terrain were peculiar patterns, geometric lines and shapes that seemed too precise to be natural. Erosion, maybe, Eleanor suggested, though the explanation felt weak even as she said it. Erosion doesn't create perfect hexagons, Lila countered. And look at the spacing. It's almost architectural. Eleanor hesitated, the hairs on the back of her neck prickling. "We're not here to explore Proxima B. Our focus is the accelerator." Lila's lips thinned, but she nodded. "Still, it's worth noting." The first sign of trouble came 3 days later. Grant was troubleshooting a power fluctuation in one of the accelerator's segments when he found something that shouldn't have been there, a sticky, viscous residue coating one of the conduits. At first, he thought it was just grease, but when he touched it, the substance pulsed faintly under his fingers as though it were alive. "What the hell is this?" he muttered, pulling his hand back sharply. The residue clung to his glove, faintly luminous, and gave off a faint, acrid smell. He called Eleanor to the site. Together, they examined the substance, running preliminary scans. It was organic, a mix of proteins, enzymes, and cellular material, but none of it matched any known terrestrial organism. Grant was visibly unnerved, though he tried to hide it behind his usual sarcasm. "Great. First alien discovery and it's goo. Just what I signed up for." Eleanor tried to dismiss it as contamination from an old drone or a malfunctioning storage unit, but unease gnawed at her. She ordered the residue to be contained and analyzed, then filed the incident in her daily report. "Let's not jump to conclusions," she told Grant, though the look in her eyes betrayed her uncertainty. That night, as the ship's lights dimmed for the simulated night cycle, Eleanor sat alone in her quarters, staring at her monitor. She replayed the data on the residue over and over, her mind racing with questions. Where had it come from? How had it gotten onto the DSPA's structure? And why, when she had leaned in close, had it seemed to hum faintly, as though responding to her presence? Proxima B loomed large outside her window, silent and unyielding. Eleanor felt its presence as if it were watching her, waiting for something she couldn't yet comprehend. The hum of the DSPA's modules reverberated through the ship, a constant reminder of the crew's progress. Days passed in a blur of calculations, welding and recalibrating. The structure grew steadily, its skeletal frame becoming a near-complete ring encircling the planet. Yet the strange residue that Grant had discovered lingered in the back of everyone's mind. Despite Eleanor's assurances, the crew's unease was palpable. They spoke about it in hushed tones during their shifts and avoided the sections of the accelerator where the residue had been found, as though proximity alone could harm them. By the second week, Lila had become obsessed with the surface below. She spent every spare moment in the observatory, poring over high-resolution scans of the planet's terrain. Her fascination with the geometric patterns deepened as she discovered a new detail. The shapes were interconnected, forming what appeared to be a vast network stretching across the planet's sunlit hemisphere. She tried to convince Eleanor to let her send drones to investigate, but Eleanor refused. The DSPA was already behind schedule, and they couldn't afford distractions. "It's not a distraction," Lila argued over their evening meal. The dining area, normally a place of camaraderie, had grown quieter in recent days. The crew seemed to carry their tension everywhere now. If these patterns are artificial, they could be evidence of an advanced alien civilization. "They're just rocks," Grant muttered, picking at his ration pack. He hadn't been himself since the residue incident. His usual snark had given way to irritability, and he had developed an unnerving habit of scratching at his arms, even when there was no visible cause for discomfort. "Rocks don't form perfect fractals," Lila snapped. She turned back to Eleanor, her voice softening. "This could be the most important discovery in human history. We have a responsibility to investigate." Eleanor sighed, rubbing her temples. "We don't have the time or resources for this, Lila. The DSPA comes first. Once the accelerator is operational, we can discuss your theories. Until then, drop it." Lila bit her lip but didn't respond. Instead, she returned to the observatory that night, scrolling through endless images of the planet's surface, unable to shake the feeling that it was trying to tell her something. The breakthrough came unexpectedly. The crew had just finished a routine diagnostic on the accelerator when the DSPA's sensors picked up a faint rhythmic signal. It was a low-frequency pulse, barely detectable, originating from deep within Proxima B's crust. At first, Grant dismissed it as interference from the accelerator's magnetic field, but the signal persisted even when the DSPA was powered down. It was deliberate, repeating every 17.3 seconds with a precision that ruled out any natural cause. Eleanor convened the crew in the ship's command center to discuss the discovery. The air was thick with tension as the signal played over the speakers, a deep, resonant tone that seemed to vibrate in their bones. "What are we listening to?" Victor asked, his voice unusually quiet. "It's some kind of communication," Lila said, her excitement barely contained. "The patterns in the terrain, the signal, it's all connected. Something down there is alive." Victor's jaw tightened. "And you think it's friendly?" "I don't know," Lila admitted. "But we have to find out." Grant shook his head, his expression dark. "This is a bad idea. We came here to build the accelerator, not poke around in alien mysteries. Let sleeping dogs lie." Eleanor was torn. The scientist in her was captivated by the signal's implications, but the mission commander in her knew the risks of diverting their focus. Ultimately, her curiosity won out. She authorized an advanced scan of the planet's surface, hoping to gather more data without endangering the crew. without endangering the crew. The scan revealed a network of subterranean caverns, their walls lined with a material that emitted the same rhythmic pulse as the signal. The caverns were vast, stretching for hundreds of kilometers beneath the planet's surface. More unsettlingly, their layout mirrored the DSPA's design almost perfectly. The resemblance was too precise to be a coincidence. "What does it mean?" Victor asked, staring at the holographic projection of the caverns. "It means the DSPA isn't the first accelerator in this system," Lila said. Her voice was barely above a whisper. The implications hung heavy in the room. If the caverns were a natural formation, their resemblance to the DSPA was inexplicable. If they weren't, it meant that another civilization had built a particle accelerator on Proxima B long before humanity's arrival. And now that same civilization, or what remained of it, was trying to communicate. As the crew debated their next move, the signal began to change. Its rhythm grew more erratic, shifting between frequencies with a complexity that suggested an intelligence at work. Eleanor watched the spectrogram in silence, her mind racing. The signal wasn't just a transmission, it was an invitation. That night, Eleanor lay awake in her quarters, staring at the ceiling. She couldn't stop thinking about the signal, the caverns, the residue. Each piece of the puzzle felt connected, but the picture they formed was beyond her understanding. She felt a growing unease, as though they had crossed an invisible line by detecting the signal. It wasn't just knowledge they were unearthing, it was something ancient, something that had been waiting for their arrival. In the darkness, Eleanor's comm panel crackled to life. She sat up, her heart pounding, as a garbled voice whispered through the static. The words were unintelligible, but the tone was unmistakable. It was the same rhythm as the signal. The whispers stopped as abruptly as they had started, leaving only silence behind. Eleanor stared at the panel, her pulse racing. Whatever was down there, it had noticed them, and it wasn't going to let them leave. The Vanguard Echo felt different now. The once orderly hum of machinery and the crew's focused work had devolved into something far more chaotic. The signal continued to pulse from Proxima B, its rhythm shifting unpredictably, and the longer it played, the more it seemed to affect the crew. Sleep became elusive, tempers frayed, and a growing sense of dread filled every corridor of the ship. Grant was the first to show signs of illness. It started with tremors in his hands and a persistent rash on his arms. He dismissed it as stress, but Eleanor noticed the way he avoided meeting her eyes, as though hiding something worse. His condition deteriorated rapidly. By the third day, he was pale and sweating, his veins raised and dark beneath his skin, like something was moving inside him. When Lila insisted on examining him, he snapped, hurling a tray across the mess hall and locking himself in the maintenance bay. "I don't need help," he shouted through the door. "I just need to work." Victor ordered the door forced open, but when they entered, Grant was gone. His tools lay scattered across the floor, and the only sign of him was a smear of dark, viscous fluid trailing into the ducts. A search party combed the ship for hours, their voices echoing through empty corridors, but Grant didn't respond. The air felt heavy, suffused with the same faint hum that emanated from the signal. It was Lila who found him, though she wished she hadn't. He was crouched in one of the unfinished segments of the DSPA, his back to her. His jumpsuit was torn, and his skin glistened with the same residue they had found on the accelerator weeks earlier. His arms twitched in unnatural spasms, and when he turned, her breath caught in her throat. Grant's face was barely recognizable. His eyes were black pits. His mouth stretched wider than it should have been, and his jaw twitched as though it struggled to contain something. His fingers were longer, the bones pushing against his translucent skin, and his veins glowed faintly with a pulsing light that matched the signal's rhythm. "Grant," Lila whispered, taking a step back. He tilted his head, a grotesque mimicry of curiosity, and then lunged. She screamed, scrambling away as his elongated fingers clawed at her. Victor arrived just in time, firing his stun baton and knocking Grant to the ground. But even as he lay there, convulsing, his body continued to twist and shift, the infection spreading visibly through his limbs. Victor locked him in the medbay, but it was clear they were running out of options. Eleanor studied the bioscans with growing horror. The organism wasn't just attacking Grant's body, it was rewriting it, turning him into something alien. His DNA was being replaced strand by strand, reshaped into a new form. Whatever the residue was, it wasn't just alive, it was intelligent, and it had a purpose. Lila became obsessed with the signal, convinced it held the answers they needed. She spent hours analyzing its patterns, ignoring Victor's orders to focus on containment protocols. "We're not dealing with a virus," she argued. "This is something far more complex. It's communicating, maybe even trying to teach us." "Teach us?" Victor snapped. "It's killing us, Lila. It's turning us into monsters." "Maybe that's how it survives," Lila said, her voice distant. "What if this is evolution? What if it's showing us a way to become something more?" Victor looked to Eleanor for support, but she said nothing. The truth was, she didn't know what to believe anymore. The signal felt like a puzzle she couldn't solve, a language just out of reach. And yet, she couldn't deny its allure. It wasn't just a threat, it was a mystery, and mysteries demanded answers. Then the infections began to spread. Technician Hannah Ortiz collapsed during a routine maintenance check, her body contorting as her veins darkened and her limbs twitched. By the time they carried her to the medbay, she was unrecognizable, her skin splitting open to reveal glistening, sinewy growths beneath. Eleanor tried to isolate her, but it was clear the infection wasn't limited to direct contact. It moved through the air, the water, the ship itself. The Vanguard Echo was no longer a sanctuary, it was a breeding ground. The infected began to act with purpose. Grant, who had been catatonic for days, suddenly rose from his restraints and attacked one of the guards. He tore through the ship with inhuman speed, his elongated limbs smashing through bulkheads as though they were paper. The others followed, their movements coordinated, their grotesque forms moving with a singular, terrifying intent. They weren't random attacks. They were dismantling the DSPA, stripping it of its human-designed components and replacing them with organic growths, tendons, sinews, and bioluminescent filaments that pulsed with the same rhythm as the signal. The accelerator was becoming a living organism, a grotesque hybrid of machine and flesh. Eleanor, Victor, and Lila barricaded themselves in the command center, their options dwindling. The infected controlled most of the ship now, and the DSPA was no longer theirs to finish. It belonged to whatever was taking over Proxima B. Lila sat at her console, staring at the signal's spectrogram with wide, bloodshot eyes. "It's beautiful," she murmured. "Don't you see? It's not an infection. It's a gift." Victor slammed his fist on the console. "Snap out of it, Lila. This thing is killing us." "No," she said, her voice trembling. "It's transforming us. What if this is what we were meant to become?" Eleanor didn't respond. She was staring at the feed from the DSPA, her stomach twisting in knots. The accelerator's ring was almost complete, its segments fused together with sinewy tendrils that pulsed and writhed. It was alive, and it was waiting. The signal changed again, its rhythm accelerating. Eleanor felt it in her chest, a deep, resonant vibration that made her vision blur. She realized with dawning horror what the signal wanted. The DSPA wasn't just a tool, it was a gateway, a way for the organism to spread beyond Proxima b. Once it was activated, there would be no stopping it. "Victor," she said, her voice barely audible, "we have to destroy it. Now." But even as she spoke, the infected began pounding on the command center's doors. They didn't have much time. The pounding at the door grew louder, a grotesque symphony of wet, organic thuds and sharp, metallic screeches as the infected tried to breach the command center. Eleanor stood frozen, staring at the monitor. The DSPA's grotesque transformation was nearly complete. It pulsed like a living heart, tendrils weaving through the scaffolding, fusing with the accelerator's structure. She could see it breathing, an unnatural, rhythmic contraction that matched the signal. Whatever this organism was, it wasn't just alive, it was sentient. "They're going to get in," Victor said, his voice taut but calm. He held his weapon tightly, his knuckles white. "If we don't act now, there's no way to stop it." Lila sat at her console, her eyes glazed with something that looked like reverence. "You don't understand," she whispered. "This is bigger than us, bigger than humanity. It's not trying to destroy us, it's trying to bring us into its design, its perfection." "Perfection?" Victor spat. "It's a plague, Lila. Look around you." Lila turned to face him, her expression eerily serene. "We've spent our entire existence searching for meaning in the universe, for proof that we're not alone. And now we've found it. This is what we were always meant to become. You can't fight evolution." Victor raised his weapon. "I don't care what you think this is. I'm stopping it." "Stop!" Eleanor's voice cut through the tension, trembling with authority. Victor froze, the barrel of his weapon inches from Lila's chest. "She's not the enemy." Eleanor turned back to the console, her mind racing. The only way to destroy the DSPA and the organism was to overload its core. The resulting explosion would obliterate the accelerator, the infected, and possibly the entire planet. But there was no way to detonate it remotely. Someone would have to deliver the payload manually. "I'll do it," Victor said, as if reading her thoughts. Eleanor turned to him, her mouth dry. His face was grim, resolute. "This is on me." "No," she said, shaking her head. "We can find another way." "There isn't another way," he said, his voice firm. "You know that." Lila stood, her hands trembling. "If you destroy it, you'll be erasing the only chance we have to understand this, to become something more." Victor's eyes narrowed. If this is what it means to evolve, I want no part of it. Eleanor looked at him, her throat tightening. She wanted to argue, to plead with him to stay, but there was no time. The pounding on the door was deafening now, the sound of metal beginning to buckle under the weight of the infected. Victor placed a hand on her shoulder, his touch steady. "Get to the escape pod," he said. "Finish the job. Make sure Earth knows what happened here." Eleanor's vision blurred as tears welled in her eyes, but she nodded. "Be careful," she whispered. He smirked, a flicker of his old self shining through. "Careful doesn't get the job done." Victor moved with purpose, navigating the corridors as the ship shook with the infected's relentless assault. He carried the payload in a reinforced case, its weight a constant reminder of the stakes. The infected were everywhere, their grotesque forms writhing in the dim light, but he moved with the precision of a soldier, dispatching them with brutal efficiency. Every shot, every step, was one closer to the accelerator's core. Eleanor and Lila watched from the command center, their eyes glued to the monitors. They could see Victor's path, see the infected swarming around him like blood cells to a wound. He fought valiantly, but it was clear he wouldn't make it out alive. Eleanor's hands clenched into fists as she watched, powerless to help. When Victor reached the core, his breathing was ragged, his body battered. The DSPA loomed above him, an unholy fusion of metal and flesh, its tendrils pulsating with life. He placed the payload at the heart of the structure, his fingers trembling as he armed it. The countdown began. 5 minutes. A guttural screech echoed through the chamber, and Victor turned to see the infected converging on him. They moved as one, their elongated limbs and glistening forms a grotesque parody of human life. He raised his weapon, knowing it would only buy him seconds. "Come on," he muttered, his voice a low growl. "Let's finish this." In the command center, Eleanor's heart pounded as she watched the feed. Victor's camera cut out as the infected overwhelmed him, but the countdown continued. She turned to Lila, who sat motionless, her face pale. "We have to go," Eleanor said, grabbing her by the arm. Lila didn't move. "No," Lila whispered, her voice trembling. "I can't leave. This is my purpose." Eleanor stared at her, incredulous. "Your purpose is to die here?" "It's not death," Lila said, her eyes glistening with tears. "It's transformation." Eleanor's stomach churned, but she didn't have time to argue. She released Lila's arm and ran, her boots pounding against the metal floor as she headed for the escape pod. She didn't look back. The escape pod launched moments before the payload detonated. Eleanor watched from the viewport as a blinding light engulfed the DSPA, the ship, and the planet below. The explosion was silent in the vacuum of space, but she felt its force reverberate in her chest. Proxima B disintegrated, its surface consumed by fire, its atmosphere expelled into the void. For a moment there was silence. Then, faintly, through the pod speakers, she heard it, the signal. It was weaker now, fragmented, but it was still there. The organism had survived, a microscopic fragment drifting in the void, carried by the remnants of the explosion. Eleanor slumped in her seat, tears streaming down her face. She had destroyed everything: Victor, the crew, the mission. and it hadn't been enough. The organism was still out there, waiting, searching for its next host. She activated the pod's transmitter, her voice hoarse as she recorded her final message. "This is Dr. Eleanor Kaiden of the Vanguard Echo. If you're receiving this, do not come to Proxima Centauri. Do not activate the DSPA. We've unleashed something we don't understand, something we cannot control. Stay away." As she drifted into the void, the signal grew fainter, but it never disappeared. It would wait. It had all the time in the universe.